Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Out of the hundreds of millions spent in the Environment Department's grants and contributions program, how much has Treasury Board approved, please?
So every time that there is a new program, the department must come to Treasury Board for review and approval. So every time it's a new program, terms and conditions, they have to come. So I would say it would depend which calendar fiscal year you're referring to. But again, that's the principle, and that's the process that we are applying every time, not only for ECCC, but for all organizations across the Government of Canada.
Okay, so Treasury Board would have approved the funds for this program on a fiscal year-by-year basis. Is that correct?
It depends. If it is funding for ongoing program, it will have been approved once at Treasury Board. But after that, as you know, because this committee is quite involved with the estimates, every time they will have to come and present their new funding via an estimate.
Has your department ever reviewed the program to ensure that funds were going to recipients that had clear plans to improve environmental protections?
So this responsibility, as I stated in my opening remarks, belong to the DPLE heads. So the DPLE heads will have the opportunity to request internal audit to look into that, and that's exactly what ECCC requested the Deputy Minister, because he had some concerns. So he wanted to have a third-party review or a independent assessment from his internal audit function.
The report states that the top ADM committee evaluates proposals deemed to be medium to high risk that exceed $100,000. However, 94% of the reviewed files in this audit did not have the right documentation to support the risk rating. Are you concerned at all about departments not doing their due diligence to ensure that funds are spent appropriately?
I am always concerned by the lack of documentation. So that's why under my group, we have what we call a center of expertise that Nicole leads. And we always remind departments that every time that there is a money going out the door, as per the Financial Administration Act, Section 32, 33, and 34, that the due diligence should be done at all levels.
Since 2016, there have been 3,103 grants and contributions awarded over $100,000. How many of these have been reviewed by the Treasury Board?
Is your question specific to ECCC?
Yes, because it would be the 3,103 grants and contributions awarded over 100K within the program.
So we do not review those programs. Like I was saying, DPLE heads are responsible for their own programs, and if they feel that there is a concern or they want to make sure that everything is effective, they will be asking their internal audit function to look into this according to the risk of the grant or of the contribution or the program itself.
The problems in the ECCC grants and contributions have been ongoing since 2016, when the minister moved from small to large-scale program delivery. The decentralized structure and limited resources were strained, which has led to potential legal and reputational damage. Has the Treasury Board done any follow-up to ensure the funds provided to this program were allocated correctly?
We have not done any specific audit regarding what you just mentioned. Again, it will be at the Deputy Minister level to look at those instances.
Are you concerned about the lack of accountability and oversight in this program?
So we are all concerned. So that's why an audit was requested by the Deputy Minister to look into that. And as well, maybe I should have mentioned my role in terms of the risk-based audit plan that all departments put together every year. Those audit plans are shared with my office for review and to make sure that we are comfortable with the risk identified and also the way forward in terms of auditing and evaluating.
Do you believe that the Environment Department has ever wasted taxpayers' money?
That's not a question that I can answer.
Okay. Do you believe the Environment Department always delivered value for money to taxpayers?
So the policy on transfer payment is clear in terms of value for money. And like I said, I will expect all deputy ministers to play their role in terms of ensuring that they are following the policy, as well as the directive and also the guideline.
In your opinion, do you believe all departments should be auditing all grants and contributions?
It would depend. It would depend which organization. It would depend the value of grants and contributions. It will depend also about other risks that departments may have. And obviously, we cannot audit everything. So again, it will be a question of considering all the potential risk, the risk mitigation strategies that departments have into place, and what's left that we feel that should be looked at.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank
Would you say that the Treasury Board President has been able to give this audit her full attention?
So I am responsible for the internal audit function within the Government of Canada.
But the Treasury Board President herself, would you say she's been available and present to give this audit her full attention?
So usually those internal audit will be the responsibility of the deputy minister.
But certainly the deputy minister interacts with the president of the Treasury Board regarding these important issues, such as the spending of taxpayer dollars. Would you say that the Treasury Board President has been less available, less access? Have you had less access to her lately?
No, I would not say she was less available for that kind of challenges or that kind of reports. I am responsible again for the internal audit function. This is up to me.
Well, it's the Treasury Board President who is ultimately responsible. And as I'm sure you're aware, she's taken on another ministry. And so it's just very concerning to me that she's being spread too thin. She's not able to give this audit her full attention, the oversight of taxpayer dollars, her full attention. We kind of have a part-time president of the Treasury Board right now, given that she's managing these two files. I certainly was shadow minister for transport during the pandemic, and I can tell you that this is a very taxing file when you're overseeing all of the airlines, the train travel, especially now the shortcomings that we've seen with our critical supply chains. And so I'm very concerned that this evidence we are receiving through this report indicates that we have a minister, a president of the Treasury Board, who is not able to give her entire attention to the oversight of taxpayer dollars. What would you say to that, please?
I am not concerned. I meet with the president every week because, as you mentioned, she's the president of the Treasury Board. They meet every Thursday morning, and before every meeting, we have a briefing with her, and we have her full attention, and we have great discussions about the files that will be presented on a Thursday morning.
But it would be impossible to have her full attention because she's giving half of her attention currently to the transport file. Now, I know in 2019, the Treasury Board issued the further guidelines, and yet we're still getting these lapses we're seeing here through the ECCC audit. A couple of months ago, we received feedback that Global Affairs Canada, through their audit, was also having some problem with the oversight of the distribution of funds. And so I really have to take it again back to the president of the Treasury Board. And so I'm just asking if you believe she's giving her full attention to the oversight of these grants and contributions, if she's been as accessible to you. And I just believe that would be very difficult for her to achieve this, her to do this, given that, frankly, how thin she's being spread over departments. And as I said, we really seem to have a part-time president right now, given this additional duties that she's been given. So given that we have these lapses through ECC, Global Affairs Canada, despite your issuing of the guidelines in 2019, I'll ask you one more time. Do you really believe that Canadians are getting value for money, that taxpayers are getting value for money?
From my perspective, I have access to the president when I need to, and she is extremely accessible for all the files that I am in charge of.
Right. Again, it's unfortunate because the results that we are seeing through, thank goodness, these audits are indicating that the oversight simply is not there at this time. As I mentioned, she was the president of the Treasury Board, now taken on the Ministry of Transport, which is a very intense file. And then, of course, given the difficult situation of the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party at this time, I'm concerned her efforts are even further diluted by the possibility of her posing a leadership campaign as well. So, I mean, this is really a president of a Treasury Board who is supposed to have oversight of all the funds of our nation, whose energy is divided, not one way. Running one department, I imagine, would be completely consuming, but is also responsible for the Department of Transport at the same time as possibly posing a leadership bid. It's quite concerning, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
An internal audit of grants and contributions programs revealed that the Environment Department was not monitoring 10% of the projects and not reviewing a further 27%. Why weren't these projects being monitored?
That will be based on the risk, I would say, of those programs. We cannot monitor all programs as we cannot audit every element. So I would say that it is a question probably for the department to provide more information about why those specific elements were not entirely looked at. The entire grants and contributions funding.
Personally, I find it quite unacceptable that here you have an environment minister not monitoring how many emissions are being reduced with taxpayers' dollars. And you really don't have a reason for it. So it's ultimately up to the minister to send that signal back to you guys to check for that?
So it is up to the deputy minister to make sure that they have the right controls into place and making sure that their programs are effective, and also to make sure that they have fulfilled their obligation in terms of terms and conditions of the contribution funding or the grant.
Can you provide a list of these projects to the committee that were not being reviewed and were not monitored?
We'll follow up with the department and provide that information to the committee.
Thank you. The government launched an $8 billion taxpayer-funded program called the Net Zero Accelerator. The government claimed they could reduce emissions by giving away $8 billion to mega corporations through this program. According to the Environment Commissioner, and I quote, "A project of more than $50 million also requires Treasury Board approval, concurrence letters from ministers of other concerned departments, and cabinet approval." The Commissioner also states that the Net Zero Accelerator projects, and I quote, "can be fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister," end quote. How many Net Zero Accelerator projects were fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister?
That I don't have the information for you. We can go back to the department. But my understanding is the commissioner will be appearing just after us, so that could be a question for him.
So in that list of people, it does go to the Treasury Board, and do you have any recollection of any letters, anything like that would never go past your desk? As far as the letter?
No, I don't have any recollection.
Okay, thank you. Are you aware of any other emission reduction projects that can be fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister?
I'm not aware, no.
Treasury Board is required to approve Net Zero Accelerator projects that receive more than $50 million. How many emissions have been reduced to date from the approved projects?
this will a good reference point will be to go in the departmental plan and departmental result report, where the information will be provided for each of those programs.
But don't you do an audit on these programs? The whole idea of releasing the funds is to get outcomes. And the Treasury Board is watching over that. And that's what you gave before for testimony. So why don't you know the answer to that?
I'm not responsible for the outcomes for all those departments. Deputy heads that are administering those programs for those departments will be in a better position to provide the answers to your questions.
So the Deputy Minister of Environment would know about the Net Zero Accelerator Fund.
Yeah, this is a program that is part of his department. That's correct.
It's interesting because he said he didn't know anything about it. So I guess we'll have to get him back here in front of committee. Is the Environment Department fully monitoring the results of their grants and contribution spending?
So they're doing audits, like I said, and I would like also to add that as per the Financial Administration Act, every programs need to be greater than $5 million, need to be evaluated every 5 years. So that is a requirement in the law. So every department need to do that.
So they are. I'll ask the question again, just so we're clear. Is the Environment Department fully monitoring the results of their grants and contribution spending? Is it law then?
Like I said, every programs above $5 million, as per the Financial Administration Act, need to be reviewed every 5 years. And all those evaluations will be accessible on the department's website.
Okay,
Thank you very much. And we'll finish. Thanks as always for being with us. Before you go, I just have a couple quick questions myself, if you don't mind. How many of the departments have chief audit executives? And the reason I ask this is that's who did this one. We've had several other less than stellar audits. One from Global Affairs on their horrific non-practice of following rules on procurement. This one. How many other departments have the chief audit executives, and what direction are they taking to actually do these audits to uncover similar messes that we have here and with Global Affairs and elsewhere?
I will provide you with the specific number right after the meeting.
Right, and who's giving the direction though to the chief to the auditor? Is it the deputy minister in each department?
So deputy minister give directions. Each big organization will have also what we call a DAC, Departmental Audit Committee, and those will be external representative that would also give feedback and also recommendation. And like I was saying, we also review all the risk-based audit plan.
But what I'm getting at, we've seen these two audits done, I assume, directed by the department itself. How many more should be getting done, considering, the millions and millions of grants being done? Heritage Canada, 50,000 grants a year. Who is directing these audits to be performed?
So myself can also direct audits to be performed.
Okay. Are you then?
Excuse me?
Are you then? And should you be directing every single department to be doing these audits? Because every audit that seems to be done seems to be a very disturbing lack of oversight, governance, rule following. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and last year my predecessor recommended to each chief audit executive to put in their plan a procurement audit. So yes, we do. We do. Every time that we feel or there is a need to do something specific, I can give the instruction to departments to put in their risk audit plan something specific. So it was done last year with my predecessor for procurement.
Well, Thank you again for your time,
Thank you.
and we'll suspend for 5 minutes, bring in the new witness.
Commissioner, an internal audit of grants and contribution programs revealed that the Minister Guilbeault's department was not monitoring 10% of the projects and not reviewing a further 27%. In fact, Minister Guilbeault's management of taxpayer dollars was so bad that according to the report, it represented, and I quote, potential legal and reputational damage, end quote. Throughout all your audits, have you ever noticed similar findings where the current government has failed to monitor taxpayer-funded programs?
So, as I mentioned in my opening statement, we haven't had a deep dive into any of Environment and Climate Change Canada's grant and contribution programs the last couple of years, but we have looked at several other departments' programs. One example from last year would be the Net Zero Accelerator Fund from ISED, and we did have concerns regarding that fund. In 2021, we had the Emissions Reduction Fund from NRCan, and we had concerns there as well. These are some of the examples of large grant and contribution programs that we have audited and found concerns with.
Do you recall how many dollars that involved?
How many dollars? Well, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund was $8 billion. Emissions Reduction Fund, the onshore program, which we audited, was between 600 and 700 million.
A lot of money, a lot of taxpayers' dollars that are not accounted for, that's for sure. Commissioner, have you ever conducted an audit that revealed the current government was not publicly measuring the value for money of taxpayer-funded programs?
Yes, so value for money is an important aspect of our work. In fact, sometimes one calls a performance audit a value for money audit. So that surfaced quite clearly in our most recent report from 2024, the Strategic Innovation Fund's Net Zero Accelerator Initiative. We have concerns about the failure to properly track and track value for money. We touch on it in other reports as well, and it's something that we're also looking at in our next audit regarding the Net Zero Act, as opposed to the Net Zero Accelerator. So it is something that we're quite concerned about. We have some calculations in here about value for money in the Net Zero Accelerator initiative, and I could get into that in more detail if you wish.
Sure. Okay, well, I'm wrestling here with the mic. Commissioner, have you ever found any evidence to suggest the current government is inflating or inaccurately reporting the emissions they claim to be reducing?
That have been reduced to date, or the claims regarding future emission reduction?
Claims.
So we have a range of audits where we find that the expected reductions have been overestimated or are the subject of overly optimistic assumptions. So if you call those claims or projections, then we do have examples of that in a wide variety of reports. It's actually disappointing. That's something that's come up in reports for many years, and we've had to say somewhat the same thing in different reports over the years in terms of overly optimistic assumptions. Probably the two that come to mind most recently would be the hydrogen audit as well as the emissions reduction fund. In both of those cases, we found that the expected reductions were overly optimistic. And then in our first Net Zero Act report from last year, we also reported on some examples, for example, in the area of public transit.
What's the implications of this? Like if the government, you're reporting this, you're telling them, look, you're double counting, you're inflating the numbers, you're not basically telling the truth to Canadians on how these programs are functioning. So what is the implications of that? What's the results? What happens?
Well, as indicated in our 2021 report on lessons learned in climate change, the failure to execute plans because of double counting, as you mentioned, overly optimistic assumptions, policy decisions that may undermine initiatives, a whole range of things. the net effect of that has been a series of failures to meet targets over the last 3 decades. So it's not just an academic question about, oh, this program isn't meeting its objective or it set out an overly optimistic objective. All of that has added up over the years to a net failure to meet any of these targets to mitigate climate change through emission reductions.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Kuzmirchuk, welcome back. Glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
Commissioner, the government launched an $8 billion taxpayer fund program called the Net Zero Accelerator. The government claimed that they could reduce emissions by giving away $8 billion to mega corporations through this program. According to your report, the Net Zero Accelerator projects, and I quote, and I got to double check this because I can't believe what I'm actually going to say here. These funds can be fast-tracked with a letter to the Prime Minister. Down at bottom of page 8 of your report. And like I say, I hesitated because I wanted to make sure I had that quote correct. I find this quite alarming, scandalous, to say the least. Does this not concern you when you reported this and when you saw this? Does it not concern you that the world's largest companies can get access to the can write a letter to the Prime Minister and say, "Here, we need some funding to we might reduce some emissions"?
So I'll start by saying that exhibit 4.2, if I recall correctly, yes, 4.2, describes the process that is available. I do not believe that we found in any of the 17 files a letter such as that. So this describes the process that can be followed, but I don't recall there being any where there was a letter to fast track. So that's an option that's available, but you'd have to confirm for sure from the department whether they've actually used that. I don't recall having seen it being used.
So why was it there?
But pardon me?
Why was it there then? If you don't recall, like I guess that's just the standards. Like
this is just describing the approval process, and that is one of the steps that's available in the approval process. It doesn't mean that in each of the 17 they went through all of these steps.
Have you ever seen anything like that?
Well, ultimately it's ministerial accountability to the decisions being made under this, and so we can do an audit. But ultimately, the accountability is with the minister in terms of demonstrating the value to taxpayers of these funds. We do have concerns, not so much about that letter because we didn't see it being used, but we did find examples. I think it was 3 of the 17 where they were fast-tracked without due diligence, and we do have a recommendation about that. To ensure that ISED's reporting of greenhouse gas reduction commitments is accurate, the department should follow due diligence and complete the assessment for all projects before agreements are signed. So that would be our view in terms of putting into place a better due diligence process before these big ticket agreements are signed.
Why the Prime Minister? Why would you send a special letter to the Prime Minister versus someone else, like a department head, like regular process? Like this is pretty extraordinary. $8 billion access fund, direct pipeline to the Prime Minister. Like why the Prime Minister? Was that ever explained to you in your audit, or did anybody ever ask that question?
Well, we're auditing their execution of the program, and we have concerns about that in terms of the value for money and the total amount of greenhouse gas emission reductions. It's up to government to decide the process, and they approve that. So I think that question would be better addressed to the Deputy Minister at ISED if he's to appear.
Deputy Minister of ISED. So that's who would issue this letter? Because this is an environment program, so would it not be the Deputy Minister of Environment that would issue? Who would write that letter to the Prime Minister?
Well, we haven't seen an example of such a letter, but my understanding is that, maybe I should explain this a little bit better. So the Net Zero Accelerator Fund is part of Environment and Climate Change Canada's emission reduction plan, but it's administered by ISED. So it's an ISED grant and contribution program.
They can still access billions of dollars through a letter to the Prime Minister, though, correct? these mega corporations?
Well, that's what's set out in the process that they provided to us as to in Exhibit 4.2, but we didn't see any examples of that letter being sent.
Wow. I guess, so I guess you don't think it's really appropriate the mega corporations can get free taxpayers' money through the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, through the Prime Minister? Do you think there's a better process?
Well, our views on this are wrapped up in recommendation 4.63, that whatever process and approval agents they want to have in their flow chart, that due diligence should happen before the approval of these agreements. That's our view. It's up to government to decide who does what in terms of the approval chain, but we would like to see due diligence prior to the commitments.
Let's take a look at Norway.
Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow up on a line of questioning by my colleague, Mr. Mazur. I want to go back and ask who would have written the programming rules stating that one could fast track approvals to the Prime Minister? Who would be responsible for that rule?
So you're looking at Exhibit 4.2 again in terms of the process.
Yes.
So that process is managed by ISED, and the witnesses earlier today would have been involved in approving the creation of this fund at Treasury Board. Who actually made the decision for that off-ramp where the things can be fast-tracked? I don't know, I guess, Monsieur Blouet, if we were given that information as to who approved the process set out in Exhibit 4.2?
We were not given that information.
So I'm not looking for a name, perhaps even a position. Who would have the authority to write that sort of a rule in place in a process?
So I would say that the process generally was managed by ISED. It would have required some level of Treasury Board approval. At least the program itself would have required some level of Treasury Board approval. But I would suggest that you speak to the Deputy Minister at ISED to find out specifically what position was involved in approving that aspect of the flowchart. I do not have a certain answer for you, unfortunately.
And I'm not sure if you answered this earlier. Is this a standard rule for departments to have in place when seeking approvals for certain grants and contributions?
Again, that's probably a question better directed to the deputy ministers and at a global level, the Comptroller General, who was here earlier. I haven't seen that particular example of fast tracking with a letter to the Prime Minister in other grants and contributions audits that we've done recently, but we've only looked at a few, and there are dozens and dozens of these programs. So it's better to ask someone who has more of a global view of this process, and I would say that would be Treasury Board.
Okay, thank you. In many audits your office has completed over the last few years, one of the primary issues that has been highlighted in those reports has been the lack of documentation and perhaps even mismanagement. When you see continued mismanagement called out over several years with no improvements, would you agree that a full forensic audit would help to give a full picture of the mismanagement?
One could scope an audit to look at it in a global sense, or one can look for the trends across our audits. I would say that both the audits I've spoken about earlier today, as well as some of other ones to come to mind, we have looked at the issue of open and transparent process and documentation, as you just talked about. We've had concerns about eligibility. We've had concerns about whether the expected outcomes are being achieved, for example, in the Net Zero Accelerator. And we've had concerns about whether grant and contribution programs are properly being measured, monitored, and verified. I can speak to those at a general level by connecting the dots amongst many reports Whether we would need to do another report to do that, I'm not sure. But
Okay.
those are themes that have come up
Okay.
across several reports.
So a fuller audit could be in order. Yes.
Well, an audit of that level would need to be approved by the Auditor General in
Right.
terms of looking at such a large. So it would be up to her to decide, looking at the opportunity costs against other audits. But
Thank
I
you.
can tell you that these themes have already come up in several audits, and we can connect the dots at least for those.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn over the last few seconds of
Thank
my
you, Ms. Block.
time to Ms.
So,
Kusi.
given the larger context of today, Chair, we have the 2019 Treasury Board guidelines, which clearly have not been adhered to. We saw the bad audit out of Global Affairs Canada. We now have a part-time minister, and I believe, Mr. Chair, that this necessitates greater oversight has been brought to the attention of the committee by my colleague. As such, I'm putting on verbal notice the following motion. Given that grants and contributions by Environment and Climate Change Canada has increased by $625 million since 2016, only 5.5% of all grants and contributions from ECCC were reviewed in a departmental audit. The audit stated that there was potential for abuse and mismanagement that may lead to reputational and legal damage, that this review was only an internal review and not independent, that the committee call on the Auditor General to complete a value for money and performance audit on the Grants and Contributions Program at Environment and Climate Change Canada and report the findings to the House. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.